The Valari had never known war. For 12,000 years, their civilization had grown in peace. They built beautiful cities of crystal and light. They studied the stars and wrote poetry about the universe. They believed that all intelligent beings were kind at heart. They were wrong. Ambassador. Nyla stood at the window of the orbital station called Serenity's End. Her pale blue skin reflected the starlight. As she watched the black ships appear from nowhere, there were hundreds of them, emerging from faster-than-light travel like shadows coming to life. Each ship was angular and cruel, covered in weapons that glowed with deadly energy. The Krath Dominion had arrived. Nyla had heard stories about the Krath. They were an insectoid species that had conquered 17 civilizations across 4 sectors of the galaxy. They took what they wanted. They enslaved those who survived, and they showed no mercy to those who resisted. But the Valari had no way to resist. They had no warships. They had no soldiers. They had never needed them. The first plasma bolt struck the station, and Nyla was thrown to the floor. Alarms screamed through the corridors. Emergency lights painted everything in red. She could hear her people crying out in fear as more explosions rocked the structure. She pulled herself up and ran toward the communication center. The doors were jammed, so she forced them open with her bare hands. Inside, the equipment was still working, still sending signals into the void. Nyla pressed her trembling fingers against the console and began to speak. "This is a general distress call to any species within range," she said, her voice shaking. "The Valari Collective is under attack. We are not warriors. We have no military. Our homeworld of the Sara is being invaded. Please, if anyone can hear this message, we need help. We need someone to save us." She sent the message on every frequency. She aimed it at every corner of the galaxy. And then she prayed that someone, somewhere, would answer. The message traveled through space at the speed of light. It bounced off relay stations and passed through nebulae. It crossed sectors that had never heard of the Valari. And after traveling for 3 days, it reached a small blue planet called Earth. Lieutenant Commander Amy Russo was working the night shift at the United Nations Space Command headquarters in Geneva. She was drinking coffee and reviewing routine reports when her console lit up with an incoming transmission. The computer identified it as an unknown language, but the translation software worked quickly. Amy played the message. She saw the holographic image of a blue-skinned woman with large, luminous eyes. She heard the fear in the alien's voice. She saw the explosions happening behind her. Amy played it again. Then she picked up her phone. "Get me Admiral Cruz," she said. "Right now." Admiral Sophia Cruz was 62 years old. She had served in 3 conflicts on Earth before humanity had developed faster-than-light travel. She had led the first human military mission beyond the solar system. And she had spent her entire career preparing for a moment like this. She watched the message 5 times. She studied the star charts. She calculated the distance. "How fast can we get there?" she asked. "The Valor's Edge can make it in 6 days," her aide replied. "She's our fastest carrier. Send her. And send the Iron Wolves." The Iron Wolves were the most decorated Marine unit in human history. They had fought in jungles and deserts, in space stations, and on alien moons. They were the soldiers that other soldiers told stories about. Their commander was Gunnery Sergeant Danny Vega. He was 41 years old, with a scarred face and tired eyes. He had been fighting for 20 years, and he had buried more friends than he could count. But when he received his orders, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Purpose. He assembled his squad in the hangar bay of the Valor's Edge. The massive carrier was already moving, its engines pushing it toward the jump point. Red lights bathed the Marines as they checked their weapons and armor. "Listen up," Vega said, his voice cutting through the noise. We have a mission. A species called the Valari is being attacked by another species called the Krath. The Valari are peaceful. They have never held a weapon in their lives. They are being slaughtered. He looked at each of his Marines in turn. Corporal Megan Price, who was the best shot in the unit. Private First Class Tony Reyes, who was young but brave. Sergeant Rick Tanner, who had saved Vega's life twice. The Valari sent a message asking for help, Vega continued. They sent it to anyone who would listen. And we listened. Corporal Price raised her hand. Rules of engagement, Sergeant. Vega's jaw tightened. Protect the civilians. Kill anything that threatens them. What do we know about these Krath? Tanner asked. They're bugs. Big ones. They've conquered 17 species, and nobody has ever stopped them. Vega paused. Until now. The Marines nodded. They understood. This was not a fight for territory or resources. This was not a war for political gain. This was something simpler and older. Someone had asked for help, and they were going to answer. Captain Laura Bennett stood on the bridge of the Valor's Edge as the ship approached the jump point. She was 45 years old, with gray hair and calm eyes. She had commanded ships in 3 engagements, and she had never lost one. Captain, her tactical officer said, we're receiving updated intelligence from long-range sensors. The Krath have 47 warships in orbit around the Sahara. They have ground forces on 3 continents. And the Valari? Their ships are civilian transports. No weapons. They're trying to evacuate, but the Krath are shooting them down. Bennett nodded slowly. She looked at the view screen, where the stars stretched into lines as the ship prepared for faster-than-light travel. 2,000 Marines, she said quietly, against an empire that has never been defeated. Her executive officer, Commander Greg Harris, stood beside her. Is it enough? Bennett thought about the message they had received. She thought about the blue-skinned woman pleading for help. She thought about what it meant to be human. It has to be, she said. The Valor's Edge jumped to faster-than-light speed, carrying 2,000 men and women toward a war that was not theirs. They did not know if they would survive. They did not know if they could win. But they knew one thing with absolute certainty. Someone had cried out for help. And Earth's Marines were coming. The planet the Sahara hung in space like a dying star. From orbit, Captain Laura Bennett could see the fires burning across 3 continents. Great columns of smoke rose from cities that had stood for thousands of years. The crystal towers of the Valari were crumbling, and their people were running through streets filled with terror. The Krath had been thorough. Their black warships circled the planet like vultures, shooting down any vessel that tried to escape. On the ground, their soldiers moved from city to city, rounding up civilians for processing. The word meant slavery. It meant death. It meant the end of everything the Valari had built. But the Krath did not know that help was coming. The Valor's Edge emerged from faster-than-light travel with a flash of light. Captain Bennett stood on the bridge, her eyes fixed on a tactical display. 47 enemy ships. Thousands of enemy soldiers on the ground. And she had 1 carrier with 2,000 Marines. Captain, her tactical officer said, the Krath are hailing us. They're demanding we identify ourselves and leave the system. Bennett smiled. It was not a friendly smile. Open a channel, she said. All frequencies. The communication officer nodded. Channel open, ma'am. Bennett straightened her uniform and spoke clearly. Krath vessels. This is Captain Laura Bennett of the United Nations Space. Command Carrier Valor's Edge. You are engaged in an unprovoked attack on a peaceful species. You will cease all hostile operations immediately and withdraw from this system. This is your only warning. There was silence for a moment. Then a harsh, clicking voice responded. Unknown vessel, the Krath Dominion does not recognize your authority. Leave now, or you will be destroyed. Bennett turned to her weapons officer. Target the nearest craft destroyer. All batteries. Fire. The Valor's Edge opened up with everything she had. Plasma cannons and missile launchers sent a wall of destruction toward the enemy ship. The craft destroyer tried to evade, but it was too slow. The first human shots fired in an interstellar war tore through its hull and ripped it apart. The other craft ships turned toward the human carrier. They had never encountered this species before. They did not know what humans were capable of. They were about to learn. On the ground, Ambassador Nyla had retreated to a refugee center in the capital city. The building had once been a university, a place of learning and hope. Now it was a shelter for the terrified. 3,000 Valari huddled in the basement, listening to the sounds of war above them. Craft soldiers were searching the city block by block. Their insectoid bodies stood over 2 meters tall, with 4 arms and mandibles that clicked as they communicated. They carried plasma rifles that could burn through metal. And they were getting closer. Nyla held a young child in her arms. The girl was crying, and Nyla whispered soft words to comfort her. But Nyla knew the truth. There was nowhere left to run. The craft would find them, and when they did, everything would be over. Then the sky screamed. Everyone looked up. Through the basement windows, they could see objects falling from space, trailing fire and smoke. They were moving too fast to be ships, too controlled to be debris. They punched through the atmosphere like burning fists, and they slammed into the plaza outside the university with enough force to crack the ground. The craft soldiers stopped. They turned toward the impact sites. Their weapons raised. The drop pods opened. Gunnery Sergeant Danny Vega kicked open his pod door and stepped out into the smoke. His armor was black, his visor glowing with targeting data. He raised his rifle in one smooth motion and found his first target. A craft soldier stood 20 meters away, its mandibles clicking in confusion. It had never seen a human before. It did not know what to make of this small, soft creature that had fallen from the sky. Vega fired twice. The alien dropped. "Iron wolves, fan out!" he shouted. "Secure the perimeter." 15 Marines moved like shadows through the smoke. They had trained for this their entire lives. They had fought in places where death was the only constant. And now they were here, on an alien world, fighting for people they had never met. Corporal Megan Price took position behind a fallen pillar and began picking off craft soldiers with precise shots. Each pull of the trigger meant one less enemy. Each kill meant one more civilian saved. Private First Class Tony Reyes ran toward a group of Valari who were trapped in a burning building. Plasma bolts flew past him, scorching his armor, but he did not stop. He reached the building and began pulling people out, one by one, while his squad mates covered him. A craft soldier charged at Sergeant Rick Tanner with a blade that glowed with energy. Tanner sidestepped the attack, grabbed the alien's arm, and broke it. Then he put 2 rounds through its head. The craft had conquered 17 species. They had never faced resistance like this. They had never seen creatures who ran toward danger instead of away from it. They had never fought an enemy that would not stop, would not surrender, would not die quietly. Inside the university basement, Ambassador Nyla heard the gunfire growing closer. She prepared herself for the end. But then she heard something else. A voice, speaking a language she did not understand, but translated by her device. "Civilians, stay down. We're here to help." The basement doors burst open. Nyla expected to see craft soldiers. Instead, she saw a human. Gunnery Sergeant Vega stood in the doorway, his armor covered in dust and blood. His visor retracted, showing a scarred face and determined eyes. He looked at the 3,000 Valari huddled in fear, and he spoke. "I'm Sergeant Vega, United Nations Marine Corps. We received your distress call. We're here to get you out." Nyla stared at him. This creature had crossed the stars. He had fought through an army of Krath soldiers. And he had done it for strangers. Why? She whispered. Vega did not understand the question. To him, the answer was obvious. Because you asked, he said. Outside, the battle continued. More drop pods fell from the sky, bringing more Marines. The Krath called for reinforcements, but so did the humans. Ships clashed in orbit, trading fire in the cold void of space. And on the ground, something was changing. The Valari watched these strange creatures fight for them, and they felt something they had not felt since the invasion began. Hope. By the end of the day, the Krath had been pushed back from the capital district. Their commander, a creature named Vexter, stood on his warship and reviewed the battle reports. He could not understand what was happening. His soldiers were dying by the hundreds. His ships were being destroyed. And it was all because of one species that he had never even heard of. Find out everything about these humans, he ordered. I want to know who they are and why they are here. His officers obeyed. They searched their databases. They found almost nothing. A young species from a small planet in an unremarkable system. A species that had only recently developed faster-than-light travel. A species that should have been insignificant, but they were not insignificant. They were dangerous. And for the first time in 2 centuries, the Krath Dominion felt something they had forgotten was possible. Fear. 3 weeks had passed since the Marines landed on the Sara. The Krath had been pushed back to the northern continent, but the war was far from over. Every day brought new battles, new casualties, and new questions that nobody could answer. Gunnery Sergeant Danny Vega sat alone in the field hospital. His armor was off, and his body was covered in bandages. He had taken a plasma bolt to his side during the last assault, but he had refused to be evacuated. His squad needed him. The Valari needed him. And he would not leave until the job was done. Around him, medics moved between beds filled with wounded Marines. 17 of his soldiers had died since the campaign began. 43 more were injured. These numbers kept Vega awake at night. He knew every name, every face, every story. Private Jenny Cole had been 22 years old. She had joined the Marines to pay for college. She died holding a bridge so that 300 Valari could escape. Corporal Sandberg had been 31. He had 2 daughters back on Earth. He died pushing Valari child out of the path of an explosion. Sergeant Nina Santos had been 35. She had been Vega's friend for 15 years. She died leading a charge against a Krath bunker. Vega closed his eyes and tried not to think about their faces. But they came anyway, as they always did. Sergeant Vega. He opened his eyes. Ambassador Neela stood before him, her blue skin pale with exhaustion. She had been working without rest, helping to coordinate the evacuation of civilians and serving as a translator between humans and Valari. She looked as tired as Vega felt. "Ma'am," he said, starting to rise. "Please, do not stand on my account." She sat down beside him on a supply crate. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just watched the medics work. "I must ask you something," Nyla finally said. "Something I do not understand. Go ahead. Why did you come?" Vega looked at her. "Ma'am, your species had never met ours before we sent our message. We had nothing to offer you. No trade agreements, no political alliances, no strategic value. Your soldiers are dying for us every day. And I do not understand why." Vega was quiet for a long time. He thought about how to explain something that seemed so obvious to him, so fundamental to who he was and what he believed. "My grandfather was a soldier," he said slowly. "He fought in wars on Earth, back before we left our planet. He used to tell me stories about why he fought. It was never about glory or conquest. It was about protecting people who could not protect themselves." He looked at his bandaged hands. When the first joined the Marines, I took an oath. I promised to defend the innocent and uphold justice. That oath did not have a border. It did not say I would only protect humans. It said I would protect those who needed protecting. Nyla's luminous eyes studied him. And that is enough? That simple promise? That is everything, Vega said. You sent a message into the void. You asked for help. And we heard you. That is all the reason we need. Tears formed in Nyla's eyes. They were clear and bright, and they fell like diamonds down her blue cheeks. Vega noted, with some surprise, that the expression of sorrow looked almost the same on Valari as it did on humans. Your people are extraordinary, she whispered. No, ma'am. We are just stubborn. Across the planet, similar conversations were happening. Corporal Megan Price sat with a group of Valari children in what had once been a school. The building was damaged, but it still stood. And Price had turned it into a safe place for the young ones while their parents were evacuated. She was teaching them a game from Earth. It was simple. Just throwing a ball back and forth, but the children laughed with delight. It was the first time many of them had laughed since the invasion began. Why do you stay with us? A young boy asked. His name was Ven, and he had lost his parents in the first attack. Price caught the ball and held it for a moment. Because you matter, she said. Every one of you matters, but we are not your people. Price knelt down to look Ven in the eyes. Right now, you are, and I'm going to make sure you grow up safe. I promise. In another part of the city, Sergeant Rick Tanner was teaching a group of Valari adults how to apply medical bandages. They would never be soldiers, but they could learn to help the wounded. They could learn to save lives. You hold it here, Tanner said, demonstrating on a practice dummy. Then you wrap it tight. Not too tight, or you cut off the blood. Just tight enough to stop the bleeding. A Valari woman tried to copy his movements. Her hands were shaking. I'm sorry, she said. We have never done anything like this before. Tanner put his hand on her shoulder. That is okay. You are learning. And learning is the first step. Will we have to fight? No, Tanner said firmly. That is our job. Your job is to survive. To rebuild. To make sure that everything your people have built does not disappear. In orbit, Captain Laura Bennett reviewed the tactical situation from the bridge of the Valor's Edge. The ship had taken damage in the initial engagement, but it was still operational. More importantly, reinforcements were on the way. Captain, Commander Greg Harris said, we are receiving a coded message from Earth. 3 more carriers are en route. They will arrive in 4 days. Bennett nodded. And the craft? They are regrouping on the northern continent. Our intelligence suggests they are waiting for reinforcements of their own. Then we need to be ready. Bennett walked to the view screen and looked down at the Sahara. She could see the scars of war on the planet's surface. She could see the smoke rising from cities that had burned. But she could also see the lights of refugee camps, places where Valari were safe because human soldiers stood guard. We are doing something important here, she said quietly. Harris joined her at the view screen. Ma'am, think about it. For the first time in history, humanity is fighting not for itself, but for someone else. We are showing the galaxy who we are, what we believe in, what we are willing to die for. And what is that? Bennett turned to look at him. The idea that no one should be alone. That when someone cries out for help, someone else should answer. That the strong should protect the weak, not prey upon them. She looked back at the planet. The Krath have been conquering species for 2 centuries. No one has ever stopped them. No one has ever tried. But we are trying. And maybe that is the most important thing. Maybe just trying is enough to change everything. Harris was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. I hope you are right, Captain. So do I, Bennett said. So do I. On the ground, as night fell over the Sara, Gunnery Sergeant Vega returned to his squad. They were gathered around a small fire, eating rations and talking quietly. When he approached, they made room for him. How are you feeling, Sarge? Private Tony Reyes asked. I have been better, Vega admitted. But I have been worse too. Corporal Price handed him a ration pack. We were just talking about home. About what we are going to do when this is over. Vega opened the pack and began to eat. What did you decide? I am going to see my mom, Reyes said. I have not seen her in 2 years. I am going to sleep for a week, Tanner said. I am going to eat real food, Price said. Something that does not come out of a plastic bag. They all laughed. It was a small moment of peace in the middle of war. And Vega knew that these moments were what kept soldiers going. Not glory, not victory, but the simple hope that they would someday go home. What about you, Sarge? Reyes asked. What are you going to do? Vega thought about it. He thought about his empty apartment back on Earth. He thought about the friends he had lost. He thought about the people he had saved. I am going to remember, he said quietly. I am going to remember all of it. The good and the bad. Because that is what we owe them. The ones who did not make it. The squad fell silent. They understood. They all carried ghosts with them. And they always would. But tonight, they were alive. And tomorrow, they would fight again. Not for glory. Not for conquest. But because someone, somewhere, needed help, and that was enough. The Krath Dominion did not accept failure. For 2 centuries, they had conquered every species they encountered. They had enslaved billions. They had built an empire on the suffering of others. And now, for the first time, they were losing. Grand Admiral Vexter stood on the bridge of his flagship. The Endless Night. He was old for a Krath, nearly 150 years. And he had commanded more battles than he could count. He had never known defeat. Until now. The humans have pushed us back to the northern continent, his aide reported. We have lost 32 ships and over 40,000 soldiers. Vexter's mandibles clicked in anger. How is this possible? They are a young species. They have 1 carrier, 1. They fight differently than any species we have encountered. They do not retreat when they should. They take risks that should be fatal. And they protect the Valari with a fury we do not understand. Vexter turned to stare at the tactical display. The planet the Sara rotated slowly, and he could see the positions of human and Krath forces. He could see how much he had lost, and he could see how much more he stood to lose. If we fail here, he said quietly, our empire will crack. Every species we have conquered will see that we can be beaten. They will rise against us. His aide was silent. They both knew it was true. Send the message, Vexter ordered. Tell the High Command we need reinforcements. All of them. Every ship, every soldier we can spare. We will crush these humans, and we will make an example of them. 2 weeks later, the Krath reinforcement fleet arrived. 200 warships. 100,000 soldiers. It was the largest military force the Dominion had assembled in a century. Admiral Sophia Cruz received the intelligence report at UNSC headquarters on Earth. She studied the numbers, then made a decision. Send the Spirit of Chicago, the New Dawn, and the Steadfast, she ordered. Maximum speed. Push the engines past safety limits if you have to. Our people need help. On the Sara, Captain Laura Bennett received word of the approaching Krath fleet. She gathered her officers for an emergency briefing. 200 ships, she said, pointing at the holographic display. We have 1 carrier and 12 support vessels. Reinforcements are 4 days away. Commander Greg Harris shook his head. We cannot hold against those numbers. We should consider evacuation. No. Bennett's voice was firm. If we evacuate, the Krath will slaughter every Valari on this planet. Millions will die. We stay. Captain, with respect, we will all die. Bennett looked around the room. She saw fear in some eyes, determination in others. These were her people. They had followed her into hell, and they would follow her again. Humanity is being tested, she said. The galaxy is watching. Every species that has suffered under the Krath is watching. If we run, we tell them that there is no hope, that the Krath cannot be stopped, that no one will ever come to help them. She paused. But if we stay, if we fight, if we hold the line even when it seems impossible, we tell them something else. We tell them that courage matters, that sacrifice matters, that there are people in this universe who will stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. The room was silent. We stay, Bennett said, and we fight. On the ground, Gunnery Sergeant Danny Vega received the news with grim acceptance. A new Krath assault force was pushing toward the last major refugee camp. 12,000 Valari civilians were sheltering there, waiting for evacuation. And his squad was the only unit close enough to respond. 15 Marines against a battalion, Corporal Megan Price said, checking her rifle. I have had worse odds. No, you have not, Sergeant Rick Tanner replied. But we are still going to do it. Vega assembled his squad. They were tired, wounded, and running low on ammunition. But their eyes were clear, and their hands were steady. Listen up, Vega said. We are going to hold that ridge overlooking the approach to the camp. We are going to stop everything that comes at us. And we are going to buy time for those civilians to evacuate. How long do we need to hold? Private Tony Reyes asked. As long as it takes. They moved out before dawn. The ridge was a good defensive position, with natural cover and clear sightlines. The Marines dug in and prepared their weapons. Then they waited. The Krath came with the sunrise. There were hundreds of them, pouring across the plains like a dark flood. Their plasma rifles lit up the morning, sending bolts of energy sizzling toward the human position. The ground shook with the thunder of their advance. Vega opened fire. His squad followed. The first wave of Krath fell. Then the second. Then the third. The Marines moved with precision, each soldier covering their sector, each shot finding its target. But there were too many enemies. For every Krath that fell, 2 more took its place. Private Reyes manned the heavy gun, the barrel glowing red from continuous fire. Plasma bolts struck his position, melting the rocks around him, but he did not stop. He could not stop. The civilians were counting on him. Corporal Price called out targets with mechanical precision. 3 at 2 o'clock. 5 more at 11. Heavy unit coming up the center. Tanner moved along the line, distributing ammunition and dragging wounded soldiers to cover. He took a plasma bolt to the leg and kept fighting. The pain was just noise. The mission was everything. The battle lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of continuous combat. 4 hours of holding a line that should have broken in minutes. When the Krath finally retreated, 6 Marines were dead. Every survivor was wounded. Vega's rifle had run empty, and he had killed the last attacking soldier with his combat knife. But behind them, 12,000 Valari civilians were alive. The evacuation transports were already lifting off, carrying them to safety. In orbit, the Battle of the Tsar's Gate was reaching its climax. The Krath fleet had surrounded the human position, pouring fire into the Valor's Edge and its escorts. Captain Bennett stood on her damaged bridge, blood running from a cut on her forehead, giving orders with calm authority. Redirect power from life support on Deck 7 through 12 to the forward shields, she commanded. Target their flagship. All weapons. The Valor's Edge fired everything it had left. The shots slammed into the endless night, ripping through its armor. But the crash ship was still fighting, still pouring destruction into the human fleet. Then, like a miracle, 3 points of light appeared in the void. The spirit of Chicago, the new dawn, and the steadfast emerged from faster-than-light travel, their weapons already firing. They had pushed their engines beyond all safety limits, arriving days ahead of schedule. And they had brought death with them. The Krath fleet, caught between the original human forces and the new arrivals, began to crumble. Ships exploded. Others tried to flee. Grand Admiral Vexter, watching his flagship burn around him, gave the order he had never thought he would give. All ships, retreat. Fall back to Dominion space. The Krath Dominion had lost their first war in 2 centuries. On the surface of the Sara, the surviving Marines watched the Krath dropships lift off and flee. They were too tired to cheer, too wounded to celebrate. But they knew what they had done. Gunnery Sergeant Vega sat down on the blood-soaked ground and looked up at the sky. Somewhere up there, the human fleet was victorious. Somewhere down here, 12,000 civilians were safe. And somewhere in his heart, 17 more ghosts had joined the ones he already carried. But they had won. Against all odds, against an enemy that had never been defeated, they had won. Corporal Price sat down beside him. Her armor was scorched, and her hands were shaking with exhaustion. "We did it, Sarge," she said quietly. Vega nodded. "Yeah, we did. What happens now?" Vega looked at the rising sun. It was beautiful, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was the first sunrise he had seen since the battle began. "Now we rest," he said. "And then we rebuild. And then we make sure this never happens again." Price nodded. She understood. The war was over, but the work was just beginning. And somewhere, watching from the stars, a galaxy full of conquered species saw what humanity had done. They saw that the Krath could be beaten. They saw that someone had finally stood up for the weak, and they began to hope. 6 months had passed since the Battle of the Sara's Gate. The fires were out. The cities were being rebuilt, and the Volari were learning to smile again. But something larger was happening, something that would change the galaxy forever. The Galactic Assembly was meeting for the first time in 30 years. Representatives from over 100 species had gathered at the Great Hall on Station Prime, a massive structure that floated between stars. They had come to discuss one topic: humanity. Ambassador Nyla, now the official Volari representative to Earth, walked through the corridors of Station Prime beside Secretary General Marcus Webb. He was 60 years old, with white hair and kind eyes. Before entering politics, he'd been a teacher, and he still had the patience and wisdom of someone who had spent his life helping others learn. "Are you nervous?" Nyla asked. Webb smiled. "Terrified. But I have learned that the best speeches come from honesty, not confidence." They entered the assembly chamber. It was enormous, with seats rising in circles around a central platform. Species of every shape and size filled the room. Some had scales, others had feathers, still others had bodies that defied human understanding. They all watched as the human delegation took its place. In the gallery above, Gunnery Sergeant Danny Vega sat in his dress uniform, uncomfortable with the attention. Beside him were the surviving members of his squad: Corporal Megan Price, Private Tony Reyes, and Sergeant Rick Tanner. They represented the thousands of Marines who had fought and bled on the Sara. "I feel like everyone is staring at us," Reyes whispered. "They are," Price replied. "Just try not to do anything embarrassing." The chamber fell silent as Secretary General Webb approached the central podium. He looked out at the assembled species, these creatures from worlds he had never seen, and he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. "We have been asked why humanity came to the aid of the Volari," he began, his voice calm and steady. "We have been asked what we wanted in return. We have been asked what our motives were. what our goals were, what we hoped to gain. He paused. The answer is simple. Nothing. We came because they asked for help. We stayed because it was right. A murmur went through the chamber. Some species did not understand. In their experience, no one did anything without expecting something in return. Webb continued. Humanity has known war. We have seen the worst of ourselves, the hatred, the cruelty, the destruction. For most of our history, we fought each other. We killed each other. We failed each other in countless ways. He looked down at his hands. But we have also seen the best of ourselves. We've seen ordinary people stand up against tyranny. We have seen soldiers give their lives for strangers. We have seen hope survive in the darkest places. And we have learned something important. He raised his eyes to meet the watching aliens. We have learned that the measure of a species is not how it treats its friends, but how it treats strangers in need. We have learned that strength is not about power, but about protection. And we have learned that the only way to build a universe worth living in is to stand together. Even when it is hard, even when it is dangerous, even when it seems impossible. In the gallery, Vega watched the Secretary General speak. He thought about the friends he had buried on the Sahara. He thought about the promises he had made. He thought about the choices that had led him here, to this moment, to this place among the stars. Earth offers its hand to this assembly, Webb continued. Not as conquerors, but as partners. We ask for nothing but the chance to stand beside you. We want to learn from you, to trade with you, to build something better with you. He paused, and his voice grew harder. But we also want to make something clear. To any who would prey upon the peaceful, who would enslave the weak, who would bring darkness to the stars, know this. We will find you, and we will stop you. The chamber erupted in noise. Clicks, whistles, growls, and sounds that had no human equivalent. It was not exactly applause, but it meant something similar. The species of the galaxy were reacting to something they had not seen in a very long time. Hope. After the speech, the assembly voted to accept humanity into its ranks. The decision was nearly unanimous. Only a few species, those with ties to the Craft Dominion, voted against Dodd as the delegation prepared to leave. A tall creature with silver scales approached Secretary General Webb. It was the Morintian ambassador, from a species that had surrendered to the Craft decades ago. Secretary General, the ambassador said, I must tell you something. Webb nodded. Please, go ahead. When my species surrendered to the Crath, we believed there was no alternative. We believed that resistance was impossible. We believed that no one would ever help us. The ambassador's scales shifted color, a sign of deep emotion. But your people have shown us something different. You have shown us that the impossible is possible. And because of that, my government has quietly begun planning something we never thought we would do. What is that? Resistance, the ambassador said. We are going to fight for our freedom. And we are going to win. Webb took the ambassador's hand. When you are ready, we will be there to help. Outside the assembly chamber, Nyla found Vega standing alone by a viewing window. The stars stretched out before them, countless points of light in an infinite darkness. Your Secretary General speaks well, Nyla said. Vega nodded. He means it. That is what matters. Do all humans mean it? This willingness to fight for others. Vega thought about his squad, about the friends he had buried on a world far from home, about the children they had saved, the families they had protected, the impossible odds they had faced because someone, somewhere, had cried out for help. Not all of us, he admitted, but enough. There are always enough. Nyla smiled. It was a gesture she had learned from humans, and it still felt strange on her face. But it felt right. Then perhaps the galaxy will be safe after all, she said. Vega turned to look at her. This blue-skinned alien who had sent a message into the void, never knowing if anyone would answer. This ambassador who had watched her world burn and still found the strength to hope. "Ambassador, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you sent that message, that distress call, did you really believe someone would come?" Nyla was quiet for a long moment. She looked out at the stars, remembering the terror and the despair and the certainty that everything was lost. "No," she admitted. "I did not believe. But I hoped. I hoped because it was all I had left. And hope was enough." Vega nodded slowly. He understood. Hope was a fragile thing, easily broken, easily lost. But it was also the most powerful force in the universe. It had carried the Valari through their darkest hour. It had brought humans across the stars to fight for strangers. And it would carry them all forward into whatever came next. "Come on," he said, turning toward the door. "We have a lot of work to do." They walked together through the corridors of Station Prime, a human marine and a Valari ambassador, two species that had never known each other until fate brought them together. Behind them, the stars burned on, indifferent to the small creatures who sailed between them. But those creatures had changed something fundamental about the cosmos. They had proven that mercy could be stronger than cruelty. They had proven that courage could outlast fear. And they had proven that when the universe cried out for help, there would always be someone willing to answer. The smoke had cleared over the Sara. And from that smoke, humanity had emerged. Not as saviors, but as neighbors. Not as gods, but as friends. Somewhere in the ruins of the Krath Dominion, conquered species were beginning to rise. Somewhere in the halls of the Galactic Assembly, new alliances were being forged. Somewhere on a small blue planet called Earth, children were learning about the heroes who had crossed the stars to help people they had never met. And somewhere, in the hearts of beings throughout the galaxy, hope was growing. Not hope in humanity, exactly, but hope in the idea that humanity represented. The idea that no one had to face darkness alone. The idea that there was always someone who would stand up for what was right. Gunnery Sergeant Danny Vega returned to Earth 3 weeks later. He visited the families of the soldiers who had died under his command. He told them what their children had done, how they had fought, how they had died as heroes. And then he went home and looked up at the night sky, at the stars that no longer seemed so far away. The universe was vast and old and full of dangers. But humanity had taken its place among the stars. And they had done it the only way that mattered, by answering a cry for help. The story of the Valari rescue spread across the galaxy. It was translated into 1,000 languages, told on 1,000,000 worlds. And everywhere it went, it carried the same message. When the darkness came, when all hope seemed lost, when the universe itself seemed to turn against them, someone had answered. Earth's Marines had emerged from the smoke, and they had struck.